In the grand stage of world literature, few tales capture the imagination as vividly as the ones we share here on Echoes of Stories. In this moment, the mists of time part to unveil one of the most enduring and thought-provoking works ever written, The Country of the Blind by the visionary Herbert George Wells. Born in England in 1866, Herbert George Wells became one of the defining voices of modern storytelling. Known to many as the father of science fiction, he journeyed through time, space, and the depths of human nature in works like The War of the Worlds and The Time Machine. Yet, beyond his grand adventures, he also wove tales that explored human perception, resilience, and the clash between belief and reality. First published in 1904, The Country of the Blind is a timeless fable about isolation, adaptation, and the limits of understanding. The version you're about to hear is drawn from the public domain archives of Project Gutenberg. Now, the hidden valley awaits us, a place where sight holds no meaning and vision takes on an entirely new form. The journey begins. This is the Country of the Blind. 300 miles and more from Chimborazo, and 100 miles from the snowy peaks of Cotopaxi, in the most remote and untamed stretches of Ecuador's Andes, lies a mysterious mountain valley, cut off entirely from the rest of the world. This hidden place is known as the Country of the Blind. Long ago, the valley could still be reached by daring travelers who braved treacherous gorges and crossed an icy mountain pass into its peaceful meadows. And indeed, some men came, a small group of Peruvian half-breeds fleeing from the cruelty and tyranny of a corrupt Spanish ruler. But then came the cataclysm, the massive eruption of Mindobamba. For 17 days, darkness cloaked the city of Quito. In Yaguachi, the waters boiled, and dead fish floated all the way to Guayaquil. Across the Pacific slopes, landslides thundered down, glaciers melted swiftly, and floods tore through valleys. Then, in a single mighty collapse, one entire side of the Arauca crest came crashing down, forever sealing off the Country of the Blind from the outside world. One of those first settlers, by chance, had been on the near side of the gorge when the disaster struck. Forced to leave behind his wife, his child, and all his kin, he had no choice but to begin life anew in the lower lands. His new life fared poorly. Blindness overtook him, and he eventually died as a prisoner in the mines. But before his end, he told a story, one that gave birth to a legend that still echoes along the spine of the Andes. He spoke of the valley where he had grown up, carried there as a small child, lashed to the back of a llama beside a heavy bundle of supplies. The place, he said, had everything a man could wish for: crystal springs, rich pastures, a gentle climate, fertile slopes tangled with a fruit-bearing shrub, and vast forests of pine that kept avalanches at bay. Towering cliffs of green-gray stone rose on three sides, crowned with glittering ice. Yet the glaciers sent their streams far away, leaving the valley safe. It neither rained nor snowed there, yet its natural springs made the meadows lush, and irrigation could spread greenery across every acre. The settlers prospered, their herds multiplied, and life was peaceful. But one misfortune overshadowed all else. A strange sickness began to claim the sight of their children. Soon, all the valley's young, and even some grown men and women, were blind. In desperation, the young mountaineer made the dangerous journey back to the outside world, seeking some charm or holy cure. In those days, sickness was not seen as the work of germs, but as punishment for sins. He believed their plight came from neglecting to raise a shrine when they first arrived in the valley. He wanted relics, blessed objects, and prayers, anything to win divine favor. He carried in his pouch a bar of native silver, refusing to explain where it came from, claiming there was none in the valley, insisting just a little too much to sound truthful. He said the villagers had pooled their few treasures to pay for holy help. I imagine this sunburnt, gaunt young man, brim of his hat gripped tightly, telling his tale to a sharp-eyed priest. I picture him later, setting out again with his religious remedies, only to find the gorge gone, replaced by a chaos of fallen rock. What became of him afterward is mostly lost to time, except that he died badly, years later. Yet the stream that once flowed through that gorge still bursts from a rocky cave today, and his tale, half forgotten and half legend, still whispers of a hidden race of blind men out there in the high Andes. Amidst the small population of that now isolated and forgotten valley, the disease took its course. The elders became slow and uncertain in their movements. The younger ones saw only in dim outlines, and the children born to them were blind from birth. Yet life remained remarkably easy in that snow-rimmed basin, cut off from the rest of the world. There were no thorns or briars, no harmful insects, and no dangerous beasts. Only the gentle breed of llamas that had been hauled, pushed, and driven along the beds of shrunken rivers and the gorges that led them there. The loss of sight came so gradually that it was hardly noticed. The blind children were led about until they learned every part of the valley with astonishing familiarity. When sight finally disappeared altogether, the community continued on. They even managed to adapt to the blind control of fire, which they tended carefully in stone stoves. The people were of a simple origin from the start, uneducated, only lightly influenced by Spanish civilization, yet carrying faint traces of the arts of old Peru and its long-lost philosophy. Generation followed generation. Many things were forgotten, yet many things were invented anew. The memory of the greater world beyond their valley faded, taking on a mythical tone, blurred and uncertain. In all matters except sight, they remained strong and capable. In time, chance brought among them someone with an original mind, a person who could speak with conviction and influence others, and later another of similar gifts. Both passed on, leaving their mark, and the small community increased in number and in wisdom, facing and resolving whatever social or economic challenges arose. As the years went on, generation followed generation. Eventually, a child was born who stood 15 generations removed from that ancestor who had once left the valley carrying a bar of silver to seek divine aid, never to return. Around that time, by rare fortune, a man from the outside world entered their secluded community. This is the story of that man. I remembered that he was a mountaineer from the country near Quito, a man who had traveled down to the sea and seen the world, a reader of books in his own unique way, sharp-minded and enterprising. He had joined a party of Englishmen who had come to Ecuador to climb mountains, taking the place of one of their 3 Swiss guides who had fallen ill. He climbed in many places, and eventually came the attempt on Periscotopedal, the Matterhorn of the Andes, where he vanished from the outside world. The story of that accident had been told many times, and Pointer's account remained the most vivid. In it, he described how the small group worked their way with difficulty, almost vertically, to the base of the last and greatest precipice, where they built a night shelter upon a narrow ledge of rock amid the snow. With a touch of true dramatic power, Pointer described how, before long, they discovered my absence. They called out, but there was no response. They called and whistled again, and for the rest of that night no one slept. At dawn, they saw the signs of my fall. It seemed impossible that I could have made a sound. I had slipped eastward, toward the unexplored side of the mountain, far below striking a steep snow slope and plowing downward in the midst of a snow avalanche. My trail ran straight to the edge of a terrible precipice, beyond which nothing could be seen. Far below, blurred by distance, they could make out trees rising from a narrow, enclosed valley, what would later be known as the lost country of the blind, though they did not recognize it as such and saw only as another remote upland gorge. Shaken by the accident, they abandoned the climb that afternoon, and before Pointer could try again, war had called him away. To this day, Periscotopedal stood unconquered, and the little shelter crumbled in the snow, unvisited. Yet I had survived. At the end of the slope, I had fallen 1,000 feet, landing in a cloud of snow upon a slope even steeper than the one above. Down this I had been swept, stunned, and unconscious, but with no bone broken, until the grade eased and I rolled to a stop buried in the softening heap of snow that had accompanied and saved me. I awoke with the vague notion of being ill in bed, then came to full awareness with a mountaineer instinct, working myself loose, pausing to rest now and then until I could see the stars. Lying flat on my chest, I tried to understand where I was and what had happened. My limbs were intact, but several buttons were missing from my clothes. My coat was pulled over my head, my knife was gone, and my hat, though tied under my chin, was lost. My ice axe had vanished as well. I recalled searching for loose stones to build up my share of the shelter wall before the fall. Looking up, I saw in the eerie light of the rising moon the vast drop I had taken, magnified by the ghostly glow. The towering, pale cliff rose higher and higher out of the fading darkness, its strange, dreamlike beauty holding me transfixed, until a sudden wave of uncontrollable, sobbing laughter shook me. After what seemed an immense span of time, I realized I was near the lower edge of the snow. Below me stretched a moonlit slope that was now navigable, leading to the dark, broken shapes of rock-strewn turf. I forced myself upright, every joint and muscle aching, clambered out of the drift that had cushioned my fall, and descended slowly until I reached the grass. There, beside a boulder, I dropped heavily, drank deeply from the flask in my inner pocket, and immediately fell into sleep. When I awoke, it was to the sound of birds singing in the trees far below. He slowly sat up, his body aching from the long and punishing descent. Before him lay a small alpine shelf, perched at the foot of a towering precipice that rose like a massive wall into the heavens. The cliff slanted ever so slightly in the narrow gully where both he and the sliding snow had made their way down. Across from him, another sheer wall of dark rock lifted itself against the pale morning sky, standing like a silent giant guarding the valley. The gorge between these immense cliffs stretched from east to west. It was bathed in the golden glow of morning sunlight, the light spilling into every crag and crevice. Farther west, the sun's rays illuminated the jagged wreckage of a fallen mountainside, a heap of shattered stone that sealed off the gorge below. When he glanced downward, it seemed as though an equally steep abyss yawned beneath him. Yet just behind the snow in the gully, he spotted a narrow, chimney-like cleft. From its rough walls, snowmelt dripped in clear, glittering threads. It was the kind of passage only a desperate man would dare to attempt. Still, he decided to try. Surprisingly, the descent proved easier than it first appeared. He soon found himself on another desolate alpine stretch. From there, a climb over rock, challenging but far from impossible, brought him to a slope of dark green trees, their trunks swaying gently in the wind. Pausing to get his bearings, he turned his face toward the upper gorge. Ahead, it widened and opened into soft green meadows. In the heart of those meadows, he now saw clearly a small cluster of stone huts, built in a style he did not recognize. His progress was slow and sometimes nerve-wracking, as if he were creeping along the face of a wall. Over time, the warm touch of the rising sun faded from the gorge. The cheerful songs of birds fell silent, and a cold shadow began to settle around him. Yet the distant valley, with its mysterious houses, seemed to shine all the brighter for it, like a hidden jewel waiting to be reached. Soon, he came upon a slope of loose rock and rubble. In the cracks and gaps between the stones, he noticed an unfamiliar fern. Its fronds reached out like vivid green hands clutching at the light. Being a man of keen observation, he plucked a few fronds, chewed the stalks, and found their taste oddly refreshing and invigorating. By midday, he stepped at last out of the dark throat of the gorge into the open plain, bathed in full sunlight. His limbs were stiff, and every muscle ached from the journey. Finding the shade of a large rock, he sat down heavily. From a nearby spring, he filled his flask with icy water, drank deeply until his thirst was quenched, and then lingered there for a while, letting his body rest before continuing toward the settlement. The sight before him was unlike anything he had ever seen. The valley seemed to grow stranger with each passing moment as his eyes took in its details. Most of its floor was covered in lush green meadow, bright with countless flowers in full bloom. The land was divided neatly into sections, each carefully irrigated, revealing a system of cultivation carried out with remarkable precision. Encircling the entire valley was a high wall. Along the inside of this wall ran what appeared to be a great circular water channel. From it, small sparkling streams trickled down to nourish the plants in the meadow. On the higher slopes, above this channel, herds of llamas grazed quietly on thin patches of grass. Here and there, against the wall, stood small sheds that seemed to serve as shelters or feeding stations for the animals. The little irrigation streams merged into a main channel running down the center of the valley. This central stream was bordered on both sides by a wall just high enough to lean upon. The design gave the valley a strangely urban atmosphere, an impression heightened by the network of paved paths laid out with black and white stones. Each path had a neat little curb, and all ran in an orderly, deliberate manner. In the heart of the valley stood the village. The houses there were unlike the scattered, irregular buildings of other mountain communities he had known. Here, they formed continuous rows along a central street that was astonishingly clean. Doors appeared here and there, but no single window broke the smooth stretch of their facades. The walls were coated in plaster of varying shades, gray, drab, slate blue, or deep brown, applied in wild, uneven patches. The strange, almost careless plastering made him think for the first time about blindness, as though the builders could not see what they were doing. Descending a steep slope, he reached the outer wall and the water channel, with a surplus water poured away in a thin, wavering thread that fell into the depths of the gorge. Looking across the meadow, he saw men and women resting in heaps of freshly cut grass, as if taking a midday nap. Nearer to the village, a few children lay stretched out in the sun. Closer still, he noticed 3 men walking slowly toward the houses along a narrow path. Each carried pails slung from a yoke across his shoulders. They wore garments woven from llama wool, leather boots, and sturdy belts. Their caps had flaps that hung down over the back and ears. They moved in single file, yawning heavily like men who had been awake all night. Their manner radiated a calm prosperity, a quiet dignity that seemed reassuring. The traveler, determined to be noticed, climbed onto a rock and stood as tall as he could. Filling his lungs, he let out a powerful shout that rolled in echoes across the valley. The 3 men stopped at once and turned their heads, moving them from side to side as if searching for something. They faced different directions, their expressions unreadable. The traveler waved both arms energetically, but the men gave no sign of recognizing him. After a moment, they turned instead toward the distant mountains on the right and called out in reply to someone unseen. He shouted again, and then once more, making even broader gestures. Still, there was no reaction. In that moment, the thought rose sharply in his mind. The people of this strange valley must be blind. After much shouting, and with a mix of frustration and determination, Nunez at last crossed the stream by way of a small bridge. He passed through a narrow gate in the wall and drew closer to the 3 figures he had seen before. By now, his certainty was complete. These people were blind. This, beyond any doubt, was the legendary country of the blind of which old tales had spoken. The realization struck him with sudden force, filling him with both wonder and a strange sense of enviable adventure. The 3 men stood close together, shoulder to shoulder, not turning their eyes toward him, but rather angling their ears toward the sound of his approach. They seemed to be reading him by the rhythm and weight of his unfamiliar footsteps. Their posture had the closeness of men slightly wary, their faces touched with an expression that might have been awe. Their eyelids were sealed shut and sunken, as if the very eyeballs beneath had shriveled away. The sight was unsettling. One of them spoke in Spanish so broken and altered that it was almost unrecognizable, remarking that it was a man, or perhaps a spirit, coming down from the rocks. But Nunez advanced with the bold, eager steps of a young man stepping into the great adventure of life. The ancient stories of the Lost Valley and its blind inhabitants returned to his mind with vivid clarity. Running through his thoughts, like the constant beat of a drum, came the old proverb, "In the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king." Again and again it echoed in his mind, filling him with confidence. With great civility, he greeted them, speaking freely and using the full power of his sight as he addressed them. The strangers, still cautious, spoke quietly to one another, wondering where he had come from. One thought he had descended from the rocks. Nunez answered that he had crossed the mountains, coming from a land where men could see. Near the city of Bogota, a place of hundreds of thousands of people, so vast that its streets disappeared beyond the horizon. The name of sight seemed to puzzle them. One man repeated the word under his breath, as though testing a strange sound. Another insisted again that he had simply come out of the rocks. Nunez noticed that the cloth of their coats was oddly made, each stitched in a different, unfamiliar fashion. Then, all at once, they startled him by stepping toward him together, each with an arm extended and fingers spread wide. He instinctively stepped back from their searching hands. Yet one of them followed his movement with uncanny precision and caught him neatly by the arm. Without a word, they began to feel him over from head to foot. Nunez protested sharply when one finger pressed against his eye, but they seemed fascinated by that delicate organ and the fluttering lids that covered it. They examined it again with careful fingers. One, called Pedro, remarked to another, whose name was Correa, that this strange being's hair felt coarse, like the wool of a llama. Correa, sliding a soft, slightly damp hand along Nunez's unshaven chin, observed that his face was as rough as the rocks from which he seemed to have come. Perhaps, he suggested, the newcomer would grow finer in time. Nunez tried to pull back from their exploration, but their grip was steady and firm. He told them again to be careful. The third man noted aloud that the creature spoke, confirming to them that he was indeed a man. Pedro recoiled slightly at the texture of Nunez's coat, finding it unpleasant to the touch. They questioned him further, asking if he had come into their world. Nunez replied that he had come from far beyond it, over mountains and glaciers, from a height halfway to the sun, out of the vast, wide world that stretched 12 days' journey to the sea. But they seemed to pay little attention to his words. Correa remarked that their forefathers had told them men could be formed by the forces of nature, from warmth, moisture, and decay. Pedro suggested leading him to the elders. Correa agreed, but advised that they should first shout, to keep the children from being frightened, for this was a remarkable occasion. They shouted loudly, their voices carrying across the valley. Then Pedro stepped forward and took Nunez by the hand to guide him toward the village. Nunez pulled his hand free and declared that he could see. This made Correa pause in confusion, repeating the unfamiliar word. Nunez confirmed it with confidence, turning toward him, only to stumble against Pedro's pail. The third man concluded that his senses were not yet fully formed, for he stumbled and spoke strange, meaningless words. He told the others to guide him by the hand. Nunez, amused and willing to play along, agreed and walked with them, laughing quietly to himself. It was clear to him now they knew nothing of sight. Well, in time, he would be the one to teach them. He could hear the sound of voices shouting and noticed several figures gathering in the middle roadway of the village. That first meeting with the people of the country of the blind tested his courage and patience far more than he had imagined. As he approached, the settlement seemed larger than it had appeared from a distance, and the rough, smeared plaster walls looked stranger. Soon, a crowd began to form, men, women, and children. Some of the women and girls, he observed with interest, had gentle and pleasant features, even though their closed, sunken eyes revealed their blindness. They surrounded him closely, holding on to him, touching him with delicate, sensitive hands, smelling him, and listening intently to every sound he made. Some of the younger girls and children hung back as if fearful, and he noticed that his own voice sounded harsh and coarse compared to their soft, musical tones. The people pressed in on him, while his three guides stayed close, almost protectively, repeating among themselves that he was a wild man from the rocks. He tried to tell them about his home far beyond the mountain crests, naming the place from which he had come. Yet to them, the words sounded strange and meaningless, as though he were speaking in an unfamiliar language. They remarked on how his speech was unformed, how he used wild and disordered expressions. A small boy even pinched his hand and mocked the sound of the word he had spoken. The villagers speculated aloud about him, mentioning his stumbles along the way, and soon decided to bring him before their elders. Without warning, they pushed him through a doorway into a room that was completely black except for the faint glow of a fire at the far end. The crowd closed in behind him, blocking almost all daylight. Before he could steady himself, he tripped and fell over the feet of someone seated in the darkness. As he went down, his outstretched arm struck the face of another, and he felt the soft shape of features just before an angry cry rang out. Several hands grabbed him at once, and for a moment he struggled. Realizing he could not win, he stopped resisting and lay still. He tried to explain that he had fallen because he could not see in such total darkness. There was a pause, as if the unseen figures were attempting to understand him. His captors remarked to one another that he was like a newly made being, someone who stumbled when he walked and spoke in confused words without meaning. Others murmured about him in ways he could only half understand. He asked if he might sit up, promising not to resist again. After some quiet discussion, they allowed him to rise. Then the voice of an older man began to question him. Nunez found himself trying to describe the vast world beyond their valley, the sky, the mountains, and other wonders, to these elders who lived entirely in darkness. Yet nothing he said could persuade them. They understood none of his explanations, not even many of his words. For 14 generations, the people had been blind, completely cut off from the sighted world. The vocabulary for all things seen had faded or changed, and stories of the outside had dwindled into simple children's tales. They no longer thought about anything beyond the rocky slopes that enclosed their valley. Blind thinkers of great talent had once examined the remnants of old beliefs and traditions carried from the days of sight, but had dismissed them as foolish fantasies. They replaced these ideas with explanations they believed to be more reasonable. Much of the imagination once tied to vision had withered away. In its place, they had developed new ways of imagining through their finely tuned hearing and touch. Gradually, Nunez began to realize that the amazement and respect he had expected for his origins and abilities would not be given. His attempts to describe the experience of sight were dismissed as the confused ramblings of someone still unformed, speaking of incoherent sensations. Resigned, he listened as the elders began to instruct him. The oldest among them explained their view of life, philosophy, and religion. According to them, the world, their valley, had once been nothing but an empty hollow in the rock. Then came lifeless things that could not be touched, followed by llamas and a few other creatures with little understanding. After these came humans, and finally angels, who could be heard singing and making fluttering noises, though no one could touch them. This last idea puzzled Nunez until he realized they were speaking of birds. The elder went on to explain to Nunez how the passage of time in the valley was divided into the warm and the cold, terms that served as the blind equivalent of day and night. It was considered proper to sleep during the warm period and to work during the cold. If not for Nunez's unexpected arrival, the entire settlement would have been resting. The elder insisted that Nunez must have been specially created to learn and serve the wisdom that had been developed in the country of the blind. Despite his stumbling manner and confused speech, he was told he must show courage and make every effort to learn. From the doorway, the gathered people murmured encouragement. The elder then stated that their night, for in this place, what the sighted would call day was referred to as night, was already far advanced, and it was time for everyone to return to sleep. He inquired whether Nunez knew how to sleep, to which Nunez replied that he did. However, he added that he wanted food first. They brought him a bowl of llama's milk and rough, salted bread, leading him to a quiet place where he could eat without being overheard. He was then expected to sleep until the mountain's evening chill would awaken the community to begin their work once more. Núñez, however, did not sleep. Instead, he sat where they had left him, resting his body and replaying the unexpected circumstances of his arrival over and over in his thoughts. From time to time he laughed, sometimes with genuine amusement, other times with indignation. Inwardly, he resented their comments about his unformed mind and lack of senses, believing that they did not realize they were insulting someone destined to be their rightful ruler. He resolved to bring them to reason. He was still deep in thought when the sun set. To Núñez, who valued beauty in all things, the glow upon the snowfields and glaciers surrounding the valley seemed the most magnificent sight he had ever beheld. His eyes moved from that unreachable splendor to the village and the irrigated fields sinking into twilight. In that moment, a wave of emotion overcame him, and he gave heartfelt thanks to God for the gift of sight. A voice called to him from the village, using the name they had given him. He rose, smiling to himself, determined to prove what sight could achieve. They would seek him and fail to find him. But then, the same voice remarked on his stillness. Amused, Núñez took a few stealthy steps off the path, only to be warned not to tread upon the grass, for such a thing was not permitted. He could hardly believe they had detected him. He had made almost no sound at all. The owner of the voice approached quickly along the path, prompting Núñez to step back into it. He was chided for not responding to the call and was asked whether he must be led like a child, as if he could not detect the pathway by sound. Núñez responded that he could see it, but his companion dismissed the idea entirely, claiming no such thing as sight existed. Annoyed, Núñez followed, vowing inwardly that his time would come. The blind man assured him there was much to learn in the world, even as Núñez reflected bitterly on the saying that in the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. When asked what blindness even meant, the other man showed little interest in his answer. For days passed, and by the fifth, the self-proclaimed king still remained unrecognized, an awkward and seemingly useless stranger among his hosts. It proved far harder to establish his authority than he had imagined. In the meantime, he obeyed instructions and learned the customs of the valley. The practice of working and moving about during their night irritated him greatly, and he decided that would be the first change he would make once in power. The life of the blind people was simple but steady, shaped entirely by their needs. They labored, but never to excess. Food and clothing were sufficient, periods of rest were observed, and music and song were valued highly. There was love in the community, and children played freely. Their ordered world was navigated with astonishing confidence and precision. Every path in the valley radiated at fixed angles and carried unique tactile markers along its borders. Obstacles had long since been cleared away, and every practice and design arose naturally from their particular requirements. Their senses were extraordinarily sharp. They could detect and interpret the smallest movement of a person a dozen paces away, and even hear the beating of a heart. Vocal tone had replaced facial expression, and touch had replaced visual gesture. In their farming work with hoe, spade, and fork, they moved as efficiently and confidently as any sighted gardener. Their sense of smell was so refined that they could identify individuals as easily as a dog might. They tended llamas, which lived in the rocky highlands above, and returned to the wall for food and shelter with practiced ease. It was only when Núñez began to assert himself that he understood the full extent of their skill and assurance. At first, he attempted persuasion. On several occasions, he tried to explain to them the nature of sight and the differences it created in him. A few listened, sitting with heads bowed and ears turned toward him. Among them was a young woman whose eyelids were less sunken than most, leading him to imagine she might possess hidden eyes. To her especially, he wished to convey the beauty of seeing. the sight of mountains, the sky, and the sunrise. Yet they receive his words with amused disbelief that soon turned to disapproval. They informed him there were no mountains at all, only the rocky, grazing grounds of the llamas, beyond which the world ended in a great cavernous roof from which dew and avalanches fell. When he insisted that the world had no such end or roof, they regarded his thoughts as dangerous. To them, his descriptions of the sky, clouds, and stars suggested a terrifying void in place of their perfectly smooth cavern ceiling, an article of faith among them. Realizing he was disturbing them, Núñez abandoned such lofty topics and turned to the practical advantages of sight. One morning, he spotted Pedro walking along a path known as 17 toward the central houses, though still too far away to be heard or smelled. Núñez predicted to the others that Pedro would soon arrive. An older man remarked that Pedro had no business being on that path. As if to prove the point, Pedro soon turned into a different path and walked quickly toward the outer wall. When Pedro failed to appear, the villagers mocked Núñez. Later, when Núñez questioned Pedro to clear his own credibility, Pedro denied the incident entirely and even grew hostile toward him. Núñez persuaded them to allow him to climb high into the sloping meadows near the wall, accompanied by one obliging companion. To this man, he promised to describe all that happened among the houses below. He noted various movements and activities, but soon realized that the things of true importance to these people occurred inside or behind their windowless homes, events invisible to him and beyond his ability to report. Those were the only happenings that truly mattered to them, and in this he could offer no insight. The attempt failed, and the laughter they could not suppress left him humiliated. After this, he turned his mind to using force. The thought came to him of seizing a spade and striking down one or two of them in open combat, proving beyond doubt the advantage of sight. He even went so far as to take hold of the spade. Yet in that instant, he discovered something new about himself, that he could not bring himself to harm a blind man in cold blood. His hesitation did not go unnoticed. They were immediately aware that he had picked up the spade. They stood ready, heads tilted, ears turned toward him, listening intently for his next move. He felt a strange and helpless horror at the situation, nearly obeying when told to set the spade down. Instead, he suddenly shoved one man backward against a wall and fled past him, out of the village. Crossing one of their meadows, he left a trail of flattened grass behind him before stopping beside one of the paths. There was a touch of exhilaration in his chest, the kind that often comes at the start of a fight, yet it was mixed with deep uncertainty. He was beginning to understand that even conflict could not be approached in the same way when facing people whose entire mental world was built on different foundations. Far away, a group of men emerged from the street of houses, carrying spades and sticks. They spread out across several paths, advancing in a wide line. Their movement was slow and deliberate, accompanied by frequent exchanges of words. From time to time, the whole line would halt, sniff the air, and listen. At first, Núñez laughed at this behavior. Later, he did not. One of them found his trail in the meadow grass and began to stoop and follow it, feeling carefully as he went. For several minutes, Núñez watched the slow tightening of the net around him. His vague restlessness grew into a sudden urgency. He stood, moved a few paces toward the encircling wall, then turned and stepped back. Before him, the advancing line formed a crescent, utterly still, listening. He stood gripping the spade tightly with both hands, debating whether to rush at them. The pulse in his ears seemed to beat in rhythm with the old saying about the one-eyed man being king in the country of the blind. Still, the question remained, should he attack? Behind him was the high wall, smooth plastered and impossible to climb, though pierced here and there with small doors. Ahead, the seekers drew closer, and more people emerged from the street to join them. Again the thought came, should he charge? A voice called his given name from somewhere ahead, asking where he was. Nunez tightened his grip on the spade and began walking toward the cluster houses. At once, the searchers converged on his position. He swore to himself that he would strike anyone who touched him, declaring aloud that he intended to move freely through the valley and go wherever he wished. The blind men quickened their approach, their movements rapid though guided only by sound. The chase felt like a strange game of blind man's buff. With every participant blindfolded except himself, orders rang out to seize him, and he realized he stood within a loose arc of pursuers. In that moment, he knew he had to act decisively. He called out again, telling them they could not understand, insisting that he could see while they were blind, and demanding they leave him alone. Another order came, telling him to put down the spade and leave the grass. The familiarity of the command, spoken in such an everyday tone, filled him with a rush of anger. Overcome with emotion, he shouted that he would harm them if they did not keep away. Then he began to run, without a clear idea of where to go. He ran away from the nearest of them, unwilling to strike him. He stopped, then suddenly dashed toward a gap in their line. The two men nearest the opening sensed his approach and rushed inward to block it. He lunged forward, realizing he was about to be caught, and then the spade came down. He felt the dull impact against a hand and arm, heard a cry of pain, and was through. In a moment, he was back near the street of houses. Blind men, swinging spades and sticks, moved with a purposeful swiftness in every direction. Behind him, footsteps sounded, and he turned just in time to see a tall man charging and striking at the noise he made. Losing his nerve, Nunez hurled the spade wide of his opponent and spun away, fleeing through the chaos and shouting as he dodged another who lunged at him. He was gripped by panic. In a blind rush, he darted back and forth, dodging even when there was no need, his eyes darting everywhere at once until he stumbled. When he fell, they heard it. Far away, in the wall that enclosed the valley, a small doorway appeared to him like a gateway to heaven. Without thinking, he bolted toward it. He didn't look back until he had crossed the bridge, scrambled a short way among the rocks, startled a young llama into leaping out of sight, and collapsed, gasping for breath. His bold attempt had ended in complete failure. For the next 2 nights and days, he stayed outside the wall, alone, without food or shelter. He thought bitterly about the unexpected turn of events, and he kept repeating the old saying about the one-eyed man being king, each time with more derision than before. He imagined ways to fight and subdue the blind villagers, but it became painfully clear there was no practical way forward. He had no weapons, and getting one now would be nearly impossible. Even if he could kill one of them, perhaps threatening to kill the rest to gain power, there was the problem of sleep. He would have to rest eventually. And somewhere deep inside, the remnants of his old life in Bogota kept him from murdering a blind man in cold blood. He tried searching for food among the pine trees, huddling under the branches at night as frost settled in. He even considered catching a llama to kill for meat, perhaps with a stone, but the animals distrusted him, watching with wary brown eyes and spitting whenever he came close. By the second day, weakness and shivering set in. At last, he dragged himself down to the valley wall to try and make peace. Crawling along beside the stream, he shouted until 2 blind men came to the gate. He admitted he had been foolish, claiming he had only been newly arrived and unwise before. He said he was different now, that he regretted everything. Tears came to his eyes, unplanned but genuine from weakness and illness, and the men seemed to take this as a good sign. They asked if he still believed in the strange idea that he could see, and he denied it, calling it meaningless. They asked him what lay overhead, and he told them there was a great smooth roof of rock far above the world, then broke into hysterical sobs, begging for food before anything else. Instead of killing him, they decided he was simply an inferior fool, another example of misguided thinking. They whipped him, but gave him the simplest, heaviest labor to do. He accepted it without protest. There was no other way to live. For days, he was too ill to work, and they nursed him with surprising kindness. That softened his submission, though they still insisted he live in darkness, which was a constant misery. Learned men came to lecture him on the foolishness of his past beliefs, until he almost began to doubt his own memories of seeing the sky. Over time, he became part of their community. Faces became familiar. Names took on meaning. There was Jacob, his master, a kind man and less angered. Pedro, Jacob's nephew. And Medina Sarot, Jacob's youngest daughter. She was not considered beautiful by the blind. Her face was too sharply defined, her eyelids too smooth and closed as though they might open, her lashes too long. Her voice was soft and failed to please their acute hearing, so she had no suitors. But Nunez saw her differently. To him, she was beautiful. At first, and then, more and more, she became the most beautiful thing in the world. He began to think that if he could win her, he could accept this valley as his home forever. He found small ways to serve her, and she began to notice him. One evening, at a rest day gathering beneath the dim starlight, sweet music drifted through the air as they sat side by side. His hand brushed hers, and when he dared to clasp it, she gently returned the pressure. Later, during a meal in the dark, her hand sought his again, and in a sudden flare from the fire, he caught the tenderness on her face. It was then that he tried to speak to her. One evening, under the soft glow of the summer moonlight, she sat spinning. The light bathed her in a silver hue, giving her an air of mystery. He came to her and took a seat at her feet. With a voice filled with deep affection, he expressed his love for her and shared how beautiful she appeared in his eyes. His tone carried the tenderness and reverence of a true admirer, almost touching awe. She had never before experienced such adoration. Though she gave no definite reply, it was clear his words brought her pleasure. From that day on, he spoke to her whenever an opportunity arose. For him, the valley became the entirety of the world, while the lands beyond the mountains, where people lived under the sun, seemed like nothing more than a distant fairy tale he would someday tell her. With caution and shyness, he began to speak to her about the gift of sight. To her, sight was one of the most poetic and fanciful notions she had ever heard. She listened to his descriptions of the stars, the mountains, and her own moonlit beauty as if it were a secret indulgence. She did not believe such things could exist, and could only partly understand, yet she was mysteriously delighted. To him, it seemed as though she understood completely. Over time, his love grew bolder, and the initial awe faded into courage. He eventually resolved to ask Jacob and the village elders for her hand in marriage. However, she became fearful and delayed the matter. It was her elder sister who first told Jacob that Medina Sarot and Nunez were in love. From the very start, there was strong opposition to their union, not so much because of her value to them, but because they considered him different, even inferior, an incapable man unworthy of marriage. Her sisters strongly opposed it, believing it would bring shame upon their family. Although old Jacob had developed a certain fondness for his clumsy but obedient worker, he shook his head and insisted the match was impossible. The young men of the village were angered by the idea, seeing it as a threat to their way of life. One even insulted and struck Nunez. Nunez struck back, and in that moment, he realized an advantage in his ability to see, even in the dim light of twilight. After that confrontation, no one dared raise a hand against him, though they still rejected the idea of the marriage. Old Jacob cared deeply for his youngest daughter and was troubled to see her crying on his shoulder. He tried to explain that Nunez was not like the others, that he was afflicted by strange delusions and could never do things as they should be done. She wept as she insisted that he had improved, that he was becoming better, and that he was stronger and kinder than any other man she had known. She confessed her love for him, just as he loved her. Jakob, distressed by her sorrow and unable to ignore the fact that he liked Nunez in many ways, decided to take the matter to the council chamber. Sitting with the other elders, he listened to the discussion until the right moment came to speak. He pointed out that Nunez was improving and might someday be as sound in mind as anyone else in the village. Among the elders was a man known for his deep thinking, a doctor, the community's healer, a man with a philosophical and inventive mind. The thought of curing Nunez intrigued him. One day, while Jakob was present, the doctor brought up the subject again. He explained that after examining Nunez, he had a clearer understanding of his condition and believed there was a strong chance of curing him. Jakob welcomed the idea, expressing that it was something he had long hoped for. The doctor explained his theory. He believed Nunez's mind was affected by the strange organs called eyes, which in the rest of them were merely shallow depressions in the face, but in Nunez's case were enlarged and capable of movement. These, the doctor said, caused constant irritation and distraction to the brain. The solution, he proposed, was a simple surgical procedure to remove them entirely. With this operation, Nunez could be made perfectly sound and become a worthy citizen. Jakob praised the wonders of knowledge and hurried to share the news with Nunez. To Jakob's disappointment, Nunez reacted without enthusiasm. Jakob hinted that such a reaction might mean he did not truly care for his daughter. It was Medina Sarot who urged Nunez to consider the surgeon's plan. Nunez asked her if she wanted him to lose his gift of sight. She shook her head, but he spoke of the beauty he would be giving up. The flowers, the lichens clinging to the rocks, the light resting on soft fur, the far-off sky with drifting clouds, the sunsets, the stars, and her. For her alone, he said, it was worth having sight, to see her serene face, her gentle smile, and her graceful hands folded together. These were the eyes she had won, the eyes that kept him close to her, and now others sought to take them away. He told her that without sight, he would be forced to live forever under a roof of stone and darkness, his mind bent to the limits of their imagination. He left the thought as a question, uncertain of her heart. She admitted that sometimes she wished he would not speak in such ways. When he asked what she meant, she told him that while she loved his imagination, she was beginning to think differently. A wave of understanding passed over him, bringing both frustration at fate and a deep sympathy for her inability to fully grasp his world. He could see her silent struggle, and in tenderness, he embraced her. After a moment, he quietly asked what she would feel if he agreed to the surgery. She threw her arms around him, weeping, and said she would be overjoyed. For an entire week before the scheduled operation, Nunez could not sleep. While the others rested during the warm daylight hours, he wandered aimlessly or sat lost in thought, wrestling with the decision he had already made. Still, he remained uncertain. At last, the final day arrived. The sun rose brilliantly over the golden mountain crests, marking his last day of sight. He spent a few moments with Medina Sarot before she withdrew to sleep. He told her that by the next day, he would see no more. She pressed his hands with all her strength and promised that if a woman's heart and life could repay such a sacrifice, she would do so. He felt a deep sadness for them both. Holding her close, he kissed her and looked at her face for the last time. Silently, he said farewell to that cherished image and turned away. She listened to the sound of his slow, retreating steps, and something in their rhythm brought her tears. He walked away into the distance. Nunez had planned to go to a secluded spot where the meadows were filled with the white blossoms of narcissus. He intended to remain there until the moment of his sacrifice arrived. Yet, as he walked, He lifted his eyes and saw the morning, radiant and magnificent, spreading across the heights like an angel in golden armor descending the slopes. Before this splendor, it seemed to him that he, the blind world and the valley, his love, and everything else were no more than a shadowed pit of imperfection. Instead of turning aside as he had intended, he continued forward. He passed through the outer wall of the valley and stepped out onto the open rocks. His gaze stayed fixed on the sunlit fields of ice and snow. He drank in their boundless beauty, and his thoughts soared to the wonders beyond, wonders he was about to surrender forever. He imagined a vast, free world that was truly his own. In his mind's eye, he saw distant slopes fading into horizon after horizon, until the city of Bogota appeared, alive with movement and beauty, glowing in the daylight and shrouded in luminous mystery at night. He pictured it as a place of fountains, palaces, statues, and white houses scattered like jewels in the middle distance. His thoughts wandered to the journey from the valley to Bogota. For a few days, one could pass through winding mountain passes, drawing ever closer to the city's busy streets. From there, the river voyage would begin, day after day, through towns, villages, forests, and barren places. The current would carry one onward until the riverbanks widened, great steamers appeared, and the journey reached the limitless sea. The ocean, scattered with thousands of islands and ships faintly visible on distant routes, stretched beyond imagination. Above it all was the unbroken sky, not the small disk seen from the valley, but a vast dome of deep blue, where the stars floated in infinite space. His eyes returned to the mountain wall. He began to study it with sharper focus. Perhaps, he thought, if he climbed up that gully to the chimney-shaped opening, he might reach a high ledge where stunted pines clung to the slope. That shelf seemed to rise higher and higher as it curved above the gorge. Beyond it, there was a talus that might be manageable. From there, he might find a way to reach the precipice just below the snow. If that route failed, there could be another chimney farther to the east that might serve even better. If he could reach the amber-lit snowfields above, he would be halfway to the crest of those beautiful, untouched heights. And if fortune favored him, the escape might be his. He looked back toward the village. In his mind, Medina Sarod had already grown small and distant. Turning again toward the mountain wall, where the sunlight had first broken upon him that day, he began his climb with deliberate care. By the time the sun was setting, he was no longer climbing. He had reached a place far above the valley. His clothing was torn, his skin scratched and bruised, and small streaks of blood marked his limbs. Yet he lay resting, as though completely at ease, a faint smile touching his lips. From his vantage point, the valley appeared as a deep basin nearly a mile below. It was already dimmed with haze and shadow, while the mountain summits around him blazed with light and fire. The rocks near at hand were alive with color and detail, a vein of green mineral cutting through gray stone, a glint of crystal catching the light, a tiny patch of bright orange lichen close enough to touch. In the gorge below, shadows deepened from blue into purple, and from purple into a luminous darkness. Above stretched the unending sky, vast beyond measure. Yet he no longer studied these details. He lay still, smiling, as though it was enough to have escaped from the valley of the blind, where he had once thought he might be king. The glow of sunset faded, and night descended. Under the cold, clear stars, he remained there, unmoving, as Nunez disappeared into the towering mountains, leaving behind the valley of the blind. We are left with the echo of a world both beautiful and unreachable, a world where love, courage, and longing collide with fate itself. He chased the brilliance of the sunlit peaks, the infinite skies, and the promise of freedom, while the valley below remained bound by darkness and its own rules. This story reminds us how fragile and precious vision can be, not just the sight of our eyes, but the vision of our dreams, our desires, and the worlds we dare to imagine. Nunez's journey challenges the limits of courage, the pull of love, and the price of stepping beyond what is familiar and safe. As the stars spread across the cold, clear night above him, we are left wondering, what awaits him beyond the mountains? Will he find the freedom and the world he longs for? Or will the valley's shadow always call him back? Stay with us, for in the next story, we will continue to explore the edges of human courage and the extraordinary worlds that lie just beyond our reach. Until then, let the adventure of the mind guide you, and let your imagination soar beyond the visible horizon.